Consider what happens when you notice this massive crack running down the plaster of an old historic house. Your first instinct is probably just patch the wall, right?
Yeah, you just want to, slap on a fresh coat of paint and call it a day.
Exactly. But then a structural engineer shows up and they shine a flashlight into the dark corners of the basement and they point out that the real problem is actually the foundation.
Right, because it shifted, 80 years ago.
Yeah. And you can keep painting that wall all you want, but until you understand the ground beneath it, that crack is just going to keep coming back.
Because the visible damage is, well, it's just a symptom of a structural failure. And, that is exactly what we're doing today. We are putting on our hard hats, grabbing our flashlights, and heading into the political basement.
So welcome to our deep dive. I want to give a really special welcome to all the educators and the students joining the conversation today. We're looking at the architecture of the United States political system.
And we're doing this through the lens of Heather Cox Richardson's nonfiction book, Democracy Awakening.
Right. And the mission here is to conduct a purely structural analysis of the historical arguments she presents. We want to look at how fractions throughout history have weaponized language and crafted competing versions of the past to push the country toward authoritarianism.
And just to set the ground rules for our flashlight tour of the basement, here we are acting as structural engineers today, not politicians.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
It is, because the text we're analyzing contains some very pointed, politically charged critiques of the modern Republican Party and contemporary political figures. Our job isn't to endorse those viewpoints, or tell you how to vote.
Right. Whether you lean left, right, or center, our goal is to objectively break down how the author constructs her argument. We're just examining the rhetorical tools that she claims are being used to dismantle democratic norms.
Exactly. We are looking at the blueprints.
So looking at those blueprints, the author actually traces the roots of our modern hyperpolarized political crisis all the way back to the 1930s.
Which is fascinating, right?
It really is. She makes this compelling case that if you want to understand today's political tribalism, you actually have to start with the battle over Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal.
Because the New Deal fundamentally rewired the relationship between the American citizen and the federal government. Before the 1930s, the federal government was largely invisible in the day-to-day lives of ordinary people.
Yeah, it took a totally hands-off approach to the economy.
Right. But then you have the Great Crash of 1929, the Great Depression hits, people are, they're utterly destitute, starving in the streets.
The hands-off approach had catastrophically failed.
Exactly. So FDR introduces this active federal government designed to protect citizens from the brutal extremes of the free market. Suddenly you have a government regulating the stock market and stepping in to end child labor. Establishing
a baseline minimum wage, too.
Yeah, exactly.
And reading through this section, the human element behind that massive bureaucratic shift is it's really fascinating. The book highlights Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins.
Oh, she's such a crucial figure in this.
She is. She was the first woman ever appointed to a presidential cabinet, but it's her backstory that drives the whole philosophy of the New Deal for her. In 1911, she actually witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that was devastating.
It was horrific. 146 garment workers, mostly young immigrant women, burned to death or jumped from windows because the factory owners had literally locked the exit doors.
Wait, they locked them just to prevent them from taking breaks, right?
Yes, exactly. And that visceral horror fundamentally shifted her psychological worldview. Perkins realized that relying on the moral goodwill of business owners was not enough to protect human life.
So she brought this concept of community responsibility into the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was that the community, acting through the government, has a moral obligation to ensure basic safety and economic dignity for its people.
But introducing that kind of community responsibility, it immediately threatened the existing power structures. A massive backlash formed almost overnight.
Right, because you had a coalition of pro-business Republicans who just despised any form of economic regulation.
Teaming up with segregationist Southern Democrats.
Yeah, and those Southern Democrats hated the New Deal because they saw the writing on the wall. If the federal government has the power to regulate wages, it might eventually use that same power to dismantle their deeply entrenched racial hierarchies in the South.
Right. They realized they had these shared interests, so they formalized this alliance in 1937, by circulating something called the Conservative Manifesto.
And this was a foundational document that demanded sweeping tax cuts, the slashing of social welfare programs, and crucially, a heavy emphasis on states' rights.
Which at the time was a very clear-coded defense of segregation.
Oh, absolutely.
This feels like the ultimate brand hijacking, honestly.
Mhm.
The author points out that this coalition deliberately adopted the label of conservatives, but they stripped the word of its actual historical meaning.
They completely hollowed it out. Richardson contrasts their 1930s version of conservatism with two classical definitions.
Okay, let's hear them.
So first you have true Burkean conservatism, tracing back to Edmund Burke during the French Revolution. His philosophy was that society should value stability and government should promote slow, cautious change.
Right, based on empirical reality, not just tearing everything down for an ideological experiment.
Exactly. And second, she looks at Abraham Lincoln's conservatism. Lincoln believed the federal government had a duty to actively intervene to give ordinary people a fair chance.
Like using massive federal power to ensure equal access to resources.
Yeah, things like the Homestead Act to give away land, or funding public universities.
So a true 19th century conservative wanted to use the government to protect the original principles of the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
But this 1937 coalition repackaged the word completely. They took this really respected historical label and weaponized it to mean just one thing.
Total opposition to government regulation and the social safety net.
Yeah. By calling themselves conservatives, they were able to frame FDR's protective government as a dangerous, radical, anti-American experiment.
Which really sets up a massive historical collision. If that anti-government coalition laid the explosive charges in the 1930s over economic regulation, the detonator that eventually blew the American political landscape apart was the intersection of that federal power with civil rights.
But wait, before things blew apart, looking at the timeline, we had this era called the liberal consensus following World War II, right?
Yes, we did.
This was a period where almost everyone, even Republicans like Dwight Eisenhower with his modern republicanism, seemed to agree that the New Deal was actually good.
They agreed the government should provide a basic safety net, regulate business, and build massive public infrastructure.
Like the interstate highway system.
Exactly. And that consensus was forged in the trenches, literally. World War II required an unprecedented level of shared sacrifice.
You had diverse Americans fighting and dying together, which created this undeniable shared equity in the country.
The text highlights Doris Miller, a black messman on the USS West Virginia during Pearl Harbor. He was officially restricted to serving food and shining shoes for white officers.
But when the attack happened, he helped carry his dying captain to safety, right?
Yeah, and then he took over an anti-aircraft machine gun, firing until he was entirely out of ammunition. He earned the Navy Cross for that. And stories of incredible heroism like that from marginalized Americans cemented the national idea that democracy was defended by everyone, so it should, work for everyone.
I do have to push back on the author's framing here, though, for a second.
Sure, what are you thinking?
Looking at the timeline, was that liberal consensus ever truly a consensus? Or was it just like a temporary economic truce that was always destined to detonate the second the federal government actually tried to enforce racial equality back home?
Well, the evidence she lays out suggests it was indeed a very fragile truce. The breaking point really arrived in 1954 with the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision.
Which declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional.
Right. Suddenly, the active federal government wasn't just building highways, it was sending federal troops to enforce civil rights.
And that is exactly when the opponents of the active government found their golden rhetorical weapon.
Yep, they could now link taxation directly to racial grievance.
They started telling white voters that their hard-earned tax dollars were being forcibly taken by a tyrannical federal government and redistributed to undeserving minorities.
And to make that argument stick, they needed intellectual cover, which conservative thinkers eagerly provided. William F. Buckley Jr., in his book God and Man at Yale, performed this fascinating rhetorical gymnastics.
Oh, I remember reading about this part. How did he frame it?
He basically argued that the Enlightenment idea of relying on facts, science, and rational debate naturally led to collectivism. His logic was that if you believe humans can rationally plan a better society, you end up with massive government control.
So to fight that, he argued you had to reject fact-based debate entirely.
Yes. He demanded an orthodoxy of pure free markets and religion.
That is wild. And then Barry Goldwater comes along with the conscience of a conservative. and he effectively welds the hatred of civil rights together with the hatred of business regulation.
Exactly. And that ideological groundwork paves the way for Richard Nixon's Southern strategy. This is where we see the mechanics of abstract language really at work.
Because Nixon's strategists realized you didn't have to use explicitly racist language to win over disgruntled white voters, right?
Right, you just had to talk about states' rights, forced busing, and law and order.
These were abstract, seemingly race-neutral terms that effectively promised to maintain the traditional racial hierarchy without sounding overtly prejudiced.
Which brings us to the really chilling part of the structural analysis. The author draws a straight, unbroken line from that 1950s rhetorical shift directly to the rise of modern authoritarian tactics under Donald Trump.
So to explain how we get from abstract political language to full-blown authoritarianism, she leans on post-war scholars like Hannah Arendt, right? The one who studied the rise of European fascism.
Yeah, Arndt pointed out a terrifying pattern. Authoritarians don't usually conquer a country from the outside with giant armies. They're invited in through the ballot box.
Because they exploit a specific psychological vulnerability. When an economy shifts or social norms change, a formerly powerful group starts to feel left behind.
And the authoritarian leader doesn't offer, like, complex, nuanced policy solutions. Instead, they offer a scapegoat.
They tell this disaffected group, you didn't fail. Your country was stolen from you by sinister elites and minorities.
And this requires the followers to completely surrender their connection to objective reality. The text goes deep into the mechanics of gaslighting here.
Gaslighting isn't just lying, though, is it?
No, it's a tactic of dominance. An authoritarian forces their subordinates to publicly agree to a deliberate, obvious lie. Once you agree that the sky is green, you have surrendered your ownership of reality to the leader.
You become complicit, and because admitting you are conned is psychologically devastating, you have to continually defend increasingly massive lies.
Exactly. And the book connects this directly to the concept of the big lie, a term that traces all the way back to Hitler's Mein Kampf.
The psychological mechanism here is actually brilliant in a really dark way. A small lie is easy to debunk, but a lie so colossal, so utterly divorced from reality, it just paralyzes people.
Right, because ordinary citizens simply cannot fathom that a leader would have the sheer audacity to distort the truth on such a massive scale.
So they assume there must be some truth to it.
Yeah. And while the opposition exhausts themselves trying to carefully fact-check this massive untruth, the authoritarian leader has already successfully dictated the entire public conversation.
They own the narrative. It's like throwing a smoke grenade into a crowded room.
That's a great way to put it.
The author actually quotes Steve Bannon describing his media strategy as flooding the zone with misinformation. The goal isn't to convince you that one specific lie is the absolute truth. The goal is cognitive fatigue.
By pumping so much contradictory information, conspiracy, and outrage into the ecosystem, the human brain just gives up.
You get disoriented. You stop trying to figure out what is real, and you retreat to your most basic tribal loyalties. But reading this, I kept asking myself, why do voters actively choose this? Why enthusiastically give away your democratic power to a strongman?
Well, the psychological payoff is enormous. Drawing on Arndt's theories again, Richardson explains that the authoritarian movement gives the follower a fantasy self-image.
It strips away the mundane reality of modern life.
Yes, and replaces it with this epic narrative where the follower is a noble hero fighting a holy war to reclaim their rightful homeland. Gives them a profound, intoxicating sense of historical importance.
But if that authoritarian playbook relies on making people feel like their perfect country was stolen, that requires a very specific foundation to point back to.
Right, it requires a perfectly sanitized mythical past.
And that brings us to the battle over history itself. The author contrasts two fiercely competing historical narratives today. You have the 1619 Project, which attempts to center the brutal reality of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans in the national story.
And pushing back against that, you have the Trump administration's 1776 Commission.
Yeah. Richardson argues the 1776 Commission was an exercise in creating that necessary mythological past.
Because authoritarianism requires a fictional history where traditional hierarchies were respected, men ruled, minorities knew their place, and society was supposedly perfect until multiculturalism and secular values ruined it.
Right. By insisting that expanding rights to others is destroying a divinely inspired founding, leaders can justify tearing down the democratic system to restore that patriarchal hierarchical paradise.
Exactly.
So we spent a lot of time in the dark basement looking at these bleak authoritarian tactics. But the author doesn't just diagnose the disease, She pivots to a structural solution.
Yeah, she does. If the authoritarian relies on a fabricated myth, she argues the antidote is reclaiming the actual historically accurate, deeply messy narrative of American democracy.
And she grounds that true narrative right in the Declaration of Independence.
Richardson argues that the founders' assertion that all men are created equal was an astonishingly radical mathematical constant.
Think about the historical context. In a world that had been ruled for centuries by kings, emperors, and entrenched bloodline aristocracies, stating that no human being possesses an inherent, God-given right to rule over anyone else was a political earthquake.
It really was.
Okay, I do have to pause here because any student analyzing this text is going to hit a massive contradiction.
Oh, for sure. The hypocrisy.
Exactly. The founders wrote, all men are created equal while actively holding human beings in brutal bondage. They completely excluded women and indigenous Americans from the political system.
Yeah.
If this entire system was built by wealthy elites who actively engineered exclusion, how does the author justify calling it a democracy? Does she view the founding as a hypocritical sham or as something else?
That is the crucial tension of the entire book.
Yeah.
She addresses the paradox head-on. She acknowledges the glaring, brutal hypocrisy of the founders,
Okay.
but she views that founding principle not as a finished house, but as a seed. Her core thesis is that American democracy wasn't finalized in 1776.
The true, authentic history of the United States is the constant, persistent, often bloody struggle of marginalized people forcing the nation to actually honor its initial radical promise.
Exactly. The elites may have written the mathematical constant down, but the marginalized made it real.
The specific historical examples she uses to prove this are just gut-wrenching, but they beautifully illustrate the point. She tells the story of Isaac Woodard.
Oh, that story is so powerful. He was a highly decorated Black World War II veteran, right?
Yes. In 1946, he's taking a bus home, still wearing his military uniform. He gets into a minor verbal altercation with the bus driver.
And then a local police chief in South Carolina pulls him off the bus and brutally beats him.
Deliberately driving a nightstick into his eyes and blinding him for life. It's horrific.
And a local all-white jury acquitted the police chief despite a complete lack of defense. But Woodard's horrific suffering changed the structure of the government.
President Harry Truman was so appalled by the blinding of a veteran and the complicity of the local courts that he realized state-level juries were just nullifying the law.
It forced Truman to establish the first President's Committee on Civil Rights. Woodard's sacrifice forced the federal government to intervene to protect basic human dignity.
She also highlights Rosa Parks, but not, the sanitized version from the textbooks.
Right. Long before the Montgomery bus boycott, Parks was a hardened investigator for the NAACP.
In 1944, she organized a massive national campaign demanding justice for Reese Taylor, a young black mother who was brutally abducted and assaulted by 6 white men in Alabama.
And we see figures like Fannie Lou Hamer, who faced severe beatings and violence simply for demanding the right to vote in Mississippi.
By centering these specific voices, Richardson is structurally dismantling the authoritarian myth.
Because the authoritarian narrative claims that expanding rights to minorities and women is a dangerous departure from traditional American values.
But Richardson's argument is that expanding those rights is the defining tradition of American history.
These individuals didn't destroy American traditions. They are the engine of American democracy.
By relentlessly demanding equality before the law, they continually force the country to live up to the blueprint.
So if we distill the key takeaways from our deep dive into democracy awakening today, Richardson has presented us with a stark structural analysis of how historical narratives compete for absolute power.
On one side, you have a narrative that relies on a pristine mythological past. It uses that myth to justify inequality and convince voters that granting rights to others somehow diminishes their own status.
And it utilizes psychological tools like gaslighting, the cognitive fatigue of flooding the zone, and the weaponization of language to dismantle the active federal government.
And on the other side, you have a narrative grounded in the messy, ongoing struggle of marginalized people.
This narrative views the Declaration of Independence not as a finished achievement to be preserved in amber, but as a continuing urgent mandate to expand equality.
For the educators and students listening to this is exactly why analyzing rhetoric is so vital.
Understanding the mechanics behind the conservative manifesto, or recognizing the cognitive effects of a smoke grenade media strategy, it equips you to critically evaluate how political factions are constructing their arguments right now, today.
We highly encourage you to use these analytical tools in your own classroom discussions to see past the noise.
Because language is never just language. It is the invisible architecture that dictates what is politically possible.
We started this deep dive by looking at a historic house with a cracked wall, realizing that the foundation itself had been under pressure for decades. Richardson's text argues that the foundation of our democracy has always been stressed by those who believe some people are inherently born to rule over others.
And the political cracks we see today are just the result of that ongoing structural tension.
I want to leave you with a final thought to explore on your own. If authoritarianism fundamentally relies on a fabricated mythological past to gain power, what does a truly healthy democratic memory look like? How do you choose to remember and actively construct the history of your own nation?